Welcome to Strength for Today's Pastor, conversations with current senior pastors and leaders which will strengthen and help you in your pastoral ministry. And now, here's your host, Bill Holdridge of Poimen Ministries.
Welcome to podcast number 59, Strength for Today's Pastor. And today we're going to be talking about the ministry of the senior pastor, Jesus style. And I have with me Gayle Erwin. And I'm so glad that Gayle is able to join us for this episode. Gayle, of course, is a follower of Jesus, a longtime pastor and minister and world traveler. He's a husband, a father, a grandfather, a writer, an editor, a talker, a listener. And as most of you who listen to this know, he is the author of numerous books and magazine articles. And I just learned he's working on his 3rd million miles of flying, wherever the Lord has called him to share the message of Jesus. Lots of books, like we mentioned, the Jesus style, the Father style, the Spirit style, the Body style, which was the last of the style series. Handbook for Servants, that reminds me of a story, that reminds me of another story. And then his latest book, which I did not know about, Not Many Mighty, very pertinent to senior and lead pastors. So anyway, so glad to have you. Welcome to the program. Gayle, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, and I'm glad to do it. I'm honored.
Yeah, I'm honored too, and I think all the listeners are honored as well. So I remember meeting you back in 1974 when you were the campus pastor at Southern California College. And I remember you up on the stage during one of the campus chaplain services, and you had your blackboard up there, and you were going through all the attributes of Jesus, Jesus style, as you do in your book. And I was mesmerized. I thought it was tremendous, and it was so great to learn that later I would meet you, not as a student, but now I was a pastor of a church, and you graciously came to Monterey and did a retreat for us as well. And a couple of times you came to Monterey to speak, and it's just been great to know you over the years. But how many years has it been for you in ministry?
Well, my ministry, in a way, began without what I would call a call when my father was injured in an airplane accident that left, he was a pastor, but it left him with his left side paralyzed and brain damage. And now Mom had to make the living, and I had to see to Dad. And he was still a man, and he wanted to travel some. I'd have to go with him. I became his valet. And I even had to carry the money at the tender age of 8. So that was the beginning in the sense of my finding out what servanthood was about, because I was basically just having to live for him. And that was the whole reason for my being there. And then when I got into high school, I found myself taking a major role in the school in terms of ministry. In my very first semester there in Greenwood, Mississippi, they knew I was a pastor's kid, so they asked me to do the devotional for a high Y meeting. And, I just talked about it the way I normally would. I grew up in a church and I understood it. And when I finished, the Methodist minister who was supposed to speak to us said, "I have nothing left to say. This young man just said everything." And I began to wonder about that, because to me, I was sure I was going to be a failure. But the Lord just sort of kept talking to me and keeping me on one path. But I had planned to be a neurosurgeon all of my life because of my dad. I wanted to become a surgeon that would operate and help people with my dad's kind of injury. And so that was my goal. We were just dirt poor. And all of my life until, I can't even remember when that changed. But when I went off to college, and I had met a young lady who I found out would later be my wife. But when I went off to college, I played football and got hurt and was in the hospital for a week. And she caught a bus 200 miles away from where she lived came down and walked into my bedroom, and I thought, this lady needs to get married. So on Thanksgiving Day, I asked her to marry me at the end when I got out of the hospital. And then when I was in college, I discovered, because I'd led a protected life, I discovered how miserable the people were. They were just living, hoping they'd have at least some fun on the weekend. And that drove me to my knees, and God just sort of spoke to me and said, look, Gayle, if you become a doctor, I'll bless you. I like doctors, but you'll always be operating on unconscious people.
Mm.
And you won't change the world that way. If you want to change your world, you're going to have to preach. And I said, okay, but I still operate on some unconscious people sometimes.
Yeah, I was going to say.
And so she thought she was going to marry a surgeon, but ended up marrying a preacher. And we've been married for 62 years now.
Wow.
And I'm still just wildly in love with her.
That's so great. I was researching the DMV this morning because I have to register a vehicle, and I remembered this is Ada County. And then I thought, that's amazing. That's Gayle's wife's name. So funny. Anyway, I guess she didn't know that she has a county named after her.
Idaho's pretty advanced. I guess that's why they have an Ada County.
I think so. Well, as I was looking at your website, Gayle, servant.org, and I learned that, and I didn't know this, I learned that you've offered all your books in MP3 format as free downloads. I was amazed. That's incredible, and I just want to say thank you. And all you guys listening to this, you can go to servant.org, and of course you can buy a hard copy, which is a blessing.
Well, let me tell you what's happening now.
Okay.
Actually, all of my hard copies are free now.
Wow.
But you have to call us, because that's where they are. And, if you want a bunch of them, then we'd like for you to pay for the shipping. But the books are free, so come and get them.
Wow.
And I had a massive number printed just so we could meet the need.
Mm-hmm. And there are ways to contact you on the website. All the contact information is there, so it's easy to find you. Well, Gayle, you're fond of saying that you have only one string on your guitar. And what is that one string?
Well, it's the nature of Jesus. Back when I actually spent about 4 years on the headquarters staff of a denomination I was in at the time, but I had a lot of activity with some major university groups, and they had taken what I had taught them about interaction and fellowship and had prospered so much they wanted to do, before they were all graduated, sort of a celebration retreat. And so we did that. And I remember when I do a retreat and teach like that, I give them permission to interrupt me. And at one point, a young lady interrupted me and said, you keep talking about Christian leadership, and I don't know what that is. Is it just leadership that a Christian is in or something? I said, well, if we're going to call it Christian, we got to get it from Jesus. And I turned to, would you believe, a chalkboard. This was a long time ago. To start writing it down. And someone else brought up, said, wouldn't greatest in the kingdom teachings be valuable here? And, all kinds of lights came on. We began to write that down. And I just felt like my whole soul was being played by a band of angels. And that's where the nature of Jesus, and I knew this is the rest of my life. I would never plumb all of the depths of this. And since Jesus is where it's at, to know him is life eternal, And I figured then I want to get people to know him. I found that there was a lot of misunderstanding about Jesus. They thought he was an American and he could whip anybody, kind of thing. And nobody seemed to understand that he was a servant. He said, I didn't come to be served, which is fascinating, but to serve and to give my life a ransom for many. So he didn't come to be boss. He came to be a servant, to teach us what it was. And being a servant is a truly others-centeredness. Jesus was the one others-centered person. Unfortunately, I'm not quite that good yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we like to consider ourselves as servants until someone treats us like one, somebody said.
Yeah. And this also is where God had a lot to say to me about being a pastor, because culture shapes pastoring more than the Bible does sometimes. And we get our understanding of what it means to be a leader from what we see in the world, and that's a horrible place to get it. So he was a shock to everybody as a servant. As his apostles, I think he chose them because they were about as the worst that he could get, just to show who he could work with. And they were just typical. They desperately wanted to be the greatest. And Jesus kept teaching them, no, if you want to be great, you got to be servant of all. And it's like that went right over their heads. They didn't hear it, because right down to the very end, when they were doing what we call the Last Supper, there were 13 pair of dirty feet there. And what you do in those places is, when it's a banquet that you're invited to, then they wash your feet first, because they consider that to be the dirtiest part of the body. But none of the guys were going to wash feet, because whoever washed feet in a household would always be the lowest person. And so Jesus washed their feet, and he's still trying to teach them, because at that Last Supper, they still argued over who was the greatest. And part of the problem is, every time they sat down to eat, this was one of the traditions, they would seat themselves according to rank. So you can see why they fought every day, every time they ate.
Wow. Sounds too much like our current day sometimes.
Well, it is. And I've attended a lot of banquets, and they want me to sit at the head table or something, and I've decided I'm not doing that. It creates a problem. People quit inviting me to banquets, but that's okay. But I sit out with the people, and they appreciate it, because it's not happened before, and we can, when you're out there with them, your conversation becomes more real.
Yeah. Well, in the book, Jesus Style, which began to be birthed way back then, as you described it, you summarize the person of Christ this way. He was a servant, like you just mentioned. He didn't lord it over others. He led by example. He was humble.
Yes.
He was as a child.
Yeah.
He was as the younger, acted as the least. He was willing to be last.
Well, he was more than willing.
Yeah, that's right.
He chose that.
Yeah.
He chose that. And the reason is because he wanted to support the others and bless the others. And to do that, it had to be from a position where they would hear it and see it.
He was the perfect model. He was the chief shepherd. He is the chief poimen, which is where we get the name of our ministry, Poimen Ministries.
Right.
And,
I like that name.
The chief pastor, the chief poimen, the chief shepherd, the good shepherd. In John 10, I am the shepherd, the good one, literally. And these are all these things. And boy, how do we unpack this? How do we make this what we are as men and as leaders and as pastors of churches? That's really the issue, because we need to lead Jesus' way and by Jesus' strength, right?
Yes, and this the whole thought just constantly ruminates in my mind, and it's taken me too, because lately I've thought about one of the things that Jesus said about children. This is what the kingdom is made of, and if you want to go there, you got to be like them. And I'm thinking, wow, I always grew up people saying, grow up, man, don't be so childish, and what have you. So that bothered me until finally I realized that a child accepts things in simplicity. Dealing with them, you have to deal in simplicity. And so then I began to think, when do they get simplicity from us? And then, you read Scripture and you don't see it. But finally he led me to one, and it's Matthew 22, beginning with verse 34. It said, when the Pharisees saw that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, one of them, a lawyer, came to him and said, Teacher, what is the great commandment in the law? Now, that was what we would call a stupid question, because every practicing Jew would say that great commandment every morning is devotion. And Jesus didn't put him down. He answered it and said, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And he said, that's the first and great commandment. And the second is just like it. Now, this wasn't in the Ten Commandments, but it was part of the law. And he elevates it to the same level of his loving God. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, this people struggle with, but he goes on and he says something I had not paid attention to. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. That was their word for Bible. In other words, the whole Bible hangs on love God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself. And I thought, how simple. Now I begin to understand that the whole thing is about that. Now the problem becomes, as a pastor, how do you teach that? Well, you can about teach it only by example. And sometimes we will have parts of churches, I get around, and so they decide, okay, we'll appoint a committee to serve in behalf of the congregation and so forth. And it's like, well, what's happened is that, are they the ones that are obeying Jesus, or how do we do it as a whole congregation? It's hard to do it as a big group. This is where one of my other favorite struggles is the early church didn't even have buildings until about 300 or 400 years after Jesus, and yet they grew like crazy. And in homes, as I've discovered, most any home can handle about a dozen people, which is what Jesus had. In homes, I have to, and I get to interact. I get to know and be known. I get to pray and be prayed for. And it's such a powerful thing. I taught it, as you know, at Southern California College, and one of the classes I had was small group ministry, which I had a lot of what I call mind trippers in there. Guys, if you mention prayer, they could immediately give you an hour sermon on it, but they just don't pray. And so in that meeting, I introduced them to what it meant to love one another and to pray for one another. And I would ask them, okay, now we know each one another, and when 2 or 3 of us agree or harmonize as such anything, it'll be done. So now we can pray that way. And we would, and the next week I would ask them what happened, and they would come bounding in, man, because these trippers had never really prayed. And I say, and let's not just play around. What thing do you desperately want from God? And all of those were met because they just couldn't believe that they could really approach God that way and in a group like that. So I'm sold on those kind of fellowship groups and things. I've seen more miracles that way than any other way.
I love it. That's great. Well, I know you're all enjoying listening to Gayle share, and so we're going to be right back after this 30-second breakaway announcement.
You've been listening to Strength for Today's Pastor. Foyman Ministries appreciates your participation in prayers. If you'd like to help financially support this podcast, you can go to our website at foymanministries.com/donate. Thank you.
So that's kind of breaking down. That is breaking down part of what the Jesus style of leadership means, being among the people, loving one another. The second commandment is on the same level as the first great commandment. Those are wonderful things.
Yeah. Well, let me just say this. When we use the word leadership, we really don't see it as servanthood. We see it as being over people, calling the shots, being in charge, where Jesus just simply made life better for others. And they wanted to come and make him king. He wouldn't have anything about that. He just simply was constantly with the lowest people. 93% of the people back then were of the Amcharetz, the group that would be called the poor people of the land. And the Pharisees thought they were poor because they were cursed of God. Mm-hmm. And that's why they wouldn't have anything to do with them. And Jesus would live with them and eat with them. And they said, he's eating with sinners, because they figured that's why you were poor, it's because you were a sinner. So we get overtaken by the thought of, I'm in charge now, I'm the boss, so forth. And the word servant then gets lost.
Yeah, and in our tribe, Calvary Chapel, where I'm doing most of our ministry, the senior pastor has become the main preacher, teacher. He's the CEO, the COO, the CFO at times.
Uh-huh.
Lots of dangers there. And like you mentioned earlier, a lot of the role that we have is more cultural than it is biblical. How do we fight that?
This is a sad thing, and this is why where we were has become a denomination. You have to admit that and know that. And this isn't the first denomination I've been part of.
Right.
And the ones that I've been part of are in desperate trouble right now because the whole system is failing.
I've as I've traveled around, Gayle, I've asked to understand. I've wanted to understand how church is led and if they have any sort of leadership structure at all. And sometimes they'll pull out an org chart,
right,
which is really a top-down, org chart.
That's right. Absolutely.
I was refreshed once that I went to a larger Calvary Chapel and was meeting with them, and they pulled out a completely different kind of an org chart. It was a flat org chart. Everybody was the same.
Yeah.
And all the ministry leaders and all the team members and everyone, they were on the same level, just doing different jobs, doing different responsibilities within the church. What do you think about org charts, Gayle?
Well, I guess the only perfect org chart has somebody at the bottom who is serving.
Yeah.
And if all of them can really be at the bottom, then that's a good org chart.
Yeah.
But someone has to overrule at some point, and when you're an organization, see. And so overruling is not necessarily, it can be the same as serving, but it's just hard to build a chart to handle servanthood.
Just out of curiosity, what's your opinion on this? I mean, at what point would it be normal for a church to move from being an organism to an organization? I mean, is there a size that you've noticed that is where that typically happens, or any other earmarks?
Well, a lot of churches start small, and they learn the advantages of that kind of fellowship and that kind of praying for one another. And then they grow to the point that, well, now what do we do? And they think that the world has the organization style because somebody then wants to be in charge. Nobody wants to stay small and divide and multiply that way. So once a chart gets started, that means that it isn't happening, and we have to show how it's supposed to happen.
So in some situations, and I think there's a lot of pressure to do this too, another question, so the pastor is the one that is supposed to come up with the vision, and then he's supposed to initiate the plan, and then his role becomes, and his assistance becomes to get everybody else to buy in and fit into the vision and fit into the plan. So what are your thoughts on that? I mean, I know that I can anticipate what you might say, but...
Well, yes. That means we've bought into the culture. And, the interesting thing was the apostles had that same kind of desire. They thought surely Jesus is going to form an organization and somebody's got to be at the top of it. And they wanted to be the greatest. And they argued over it every day. And Jesus put up with those jerks. And he loves us and puts up with us now. And I think he has to overlook an awful lot of stuff, but he still loves us.
Yeah, he does.
Even when we do it in worldly ways.
So one time I was sharing with a church, and I said, you guys have great facilities, great worship team, good leaders, godly men, godly women. There's so much going on that is so healthy in this church. And I'm talking to the body in general. And I said, but the greatest asset of this church isn't any of those things. The greatest asset of this church, aside from having Jesus, is you. You're the treasure that was hidden in the field. That for joy over it, Jesus went and sold everything that he had in order that he might buy the field so that he could have the treasure.
Right.
I said, you're the treasure.
Yes.
So I'm thinking from that perspective that really, isn't it our task as senior pastors to find out how has God equipped this person? How has God wired this person? what part does this person, is he or she called by God to fill in the body, and then just encourage them and bless them and maybe coach them up a little bit to be able to do that for Jesus.
Yeah, that's good. There are dangers in that, even if we are not exempling the kind of leadership they want them to do.
Mm.
Once you tell somebody that, if they love you because of what you do, they'll appreciate what you say. And if you've exampled them for it, and they know that that's what you are complimenting in them, then that's fine. But if you are saying someone, you could be in charge someday, that gives a whole different thing. It just becomes the human thing to want to be over people.
Yeah. So that's one of the dangers that senior pastors have today. What are the critical dangers? I know a lot of people have talked about this, but what do you think, Gayle, are the critical dangers facing today's senior pastor?
Oh boy, politics is one of the main things. I can't believe how much we've bought into politics, and think that if we could just get politicians to solve one problem that we have, then everything else will go away, and that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
And it just breaks my heart to see how guys are buying into it and wanting to be seen in pictures with certain people and the like. And I happen to think that some certain people are just the father of lies almost.
Mm.
So the whole thing about aiding other people means that we example that for them, and when they think I can do that, I want to be that way, and they do it, and you can say to them, hey, here's some ways you can serve. And the question isn't becoming how high can you go, but more how low can you go. And that's never in anybody's, because you're supposed to see others better than yourself. That includes a lot of people. We have a lot of homeless people out here.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to think, when I would see someone begging on the corner, I'd think, yeah, you probably could get a job, man. Why do you do this? And then I realized there aren't that many jobs available, but a story about C.S. Lewis really wrapped me up on the head. He was walking with a friend of his in London, and they came upon a beggar, and C.S. Lewis opened his billfold and pulled out everything he had and gave it to him.
Wow.
And his friend said later, why did you do that? He's just going to waste it. And C.S. Lewis said, so was I.
Oh, my. Oh, I hadn't heard that. That's great.
And it made me rethink the money I have in my pocket.
Yeah, really. Wow. Any other dangers that you can think of that are current dangers for senior pastors?
Well, the self-centeredness that happens, because just like in government, the question becomes, if you're a senior pastor, how are you serving me? And that's a constant danger. Constant danger. Especially when they get recognized as senior pastor, and then their churches becomes a big one, and they're recognized as pastor of a big church. That's a heady thing.
And we don't have to. I mean, I've asked guys, okay, so what's your name again? And so they'll say, my name is Pastor, and then their first name and their last name. And I doubt that was on their birth certificate.
All right. Hey, that's a good thought. I got to remember that.
It's okay just to be Bill. It's just okay to be Gayle.
Right. And I introduce myself that way.
Yeah, you do.
Beyond that, they say, well, don't you have a title? Well, I have some that are not good. But no, I don't have a title. I'm just Gayle. Aren't you Reverend? No.
Right.
I'm just Gayle. You know?
Right.
And I have a struggle with that, because there are some places where I've been asked to come and speak for conventions and the like, and they always dress it up.
Yes.
But I didn't do that. I'm Gayle.
But they still invite you. You're still traveling, aren't you?
Yeah, well, not as far. My wife has gone through some real health problems, and I still need to be with her, or her with me, or somebody with her.
Mm-hmm.
And so I still do speak around quite a bit, but I have promised her to pretty much stay west of the Rockies.
Okay. All right. Well, that's a news flash, everybody listening to this. West of the Rockies, you're still potentially, able to have Gayle come.
Well, yeah, and I do. I've been up in Washington not long ago and spent a week up there, and some other churches that are not that far away, but still about a day and a half drive. So I'm doing that, and she can go with me on those.
Good.
But when it comes to traveling all the way across the U.S., it just does her in, and I can't do that to her.
Yeah.
I made some promises back when we were married, and I'm trying to keep them.
Praise the Lord. 62 years and counting.
In sickness and in health. And I'm still crazy about that lady,
Oh, that's neat. That's great. Well, you knew Pastor Chuck Smith for many years, and you watched him and got to minister alongside of him and so on. What did you observe about Pastor Chuck's life and ministry that can be a great example for pastors that you could share?
Well, one thing I noticed is that he didn't tend to disappear after things were over, but he would stay and meet with people. And he did that at his church.
Yes.
You wouldn't find him running away so that the crowd couldn't get to him. He'd be out there where he could pray for people and meet needs and talk to them and befriend them, let them know he loved them and so forth.
Yeah.
So for a big church, he did about as good as anything I've seen.
Yeah.
And the Lord used him to reach an awful lot of people at a very critical time in our history, at a moment when there were hearts that were just looking for the Lord and didn't know it. I enjoyed traveling with him. We talked about a lot of things and laughed about a lot of things. It was fun traveling with him.
Yeah.
You'll have to give me your address. I'll send you a book that my daughter Angela put together and surprised me with. And in it is a photograph that I think I'm the only one that has it. And it's the first time it's ever been published of me and Chuck in a plane.
Oh, really? Wow. Okay.
Yeah, both of us sound asleep and wearing similar clothes. You can tell me about that. I'm the one with the suspenders on.
Yeah, right. There you go. Well, as we wrap up this podcast, Gayle, I'd like to give you some opportunity just to share anything you'd like to share. I think a lot of the listeners to this podcast are Calvary Chapel pastors, but there are some that are not, within that description. But anything you'd like to share to senior pastors to strengthen them, especially with the Jesus style of living the Christian life and being a leader?
Well, since I'm at home, I'm a neighborhood man now. I've never been a neighborhood man. I've always been gone. My wife would see me off and then see me back, then see me off, and I'd be gone most of the time. And for the first time in my life, I'm a neighborhood man. I'm here most of the week, and I'm thinking, Lord, how do I touch my neighborhood? And he said, well, what do you see? I said, mostly people walking dogs. He said, there you go. So I set up a table every morning at 6:00, and I put dog treats on it, and I serve them coffee if they want it, and have seats for them, and we talk things over. I befriend their dogs, and they love me for that. I have opportunity to talk to them. Things are happening with these guys, and they're there every morning. They come.
What a great idea.
Well, it wasn't my idea.
Yeah, right.
I never thought I would do anything like that, but I love it.
So just be where you are.
And the Lord is using it.
Yeah, just
be where I am.
Yeah, be where we are. Yeah, that's the key.
And some of the local churches I've I've befriended the pastors because they are hurting, and we have time to really talk a lot of things over. And one church, when I just show up just to visit them, the pastor always points at me. You. He forgets my name. You.
You.
Come up. Here's the message. Come give us the message.
Oh, really? So just impromptu preaching that day?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. There you go. How fun.
Then, too, I fill in for some churches in the neighborhood when their pastor just either needs a break. One church has finally changed and got a new pastor, but in the interim, I did about 2 months of teaching for them.
Oh, wow.
So it was good because it's a way of getting the Jesus style in people's hands, and I'd give them to them, and they'd take every one of them, man.
Wow.
So it's a double whammy, sort of, and then I start getting feedback. I said, man, I've never read a book like this. This has changed my whole thinking. And I'm thinking, way to go, Lord.
Amen. Way to go, Lord.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Gayle, for joining us during this podcast, and I know that there's so much more we could say or you could say on this subject, but it's encouraging to me big time, and I know it's going to be encouraging to the men and others that are going to be listening to this. So thanks again for joining us.
You're more than welcome. Thanks for inviting me. Lord bless you.
Well, it's been a real treat to have Gayle Erwin with us today. Don't forget to check out those resources that are at servant.org and the incredible offer that you heard about in this podcast. And for this and all other Strength for Today podcasts, you can subscribe if you'd like to via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and other podcast outlets. And we hope to have you again with us next week. God bless you.
Strength for Today's Pastor is sponsored by Pointman Ministries. You can find us at pointmanministries.com. That's spelled Poimen ministries.com. If something in today's program prompts a question or comment, or if you have a topic idea for a future episode, just shoot us an email at strongerpastors@gmail.com. That's strongerpastors@gmail.com. May the Lord bless you as you serve Him, His pastors, and His church.